Hello, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I am Sherrilyn and I am so glad you found me. Today we are diving deep into a case that it shook the nation to its core. And I want to say nation. I say nation because I just feel like I'm a part of the United States of America because that's where the majority of my audience is. And I'm not. I'm from Canada. I'm Canadian. So it was your guys's, whoever's in the US, like it shook your nation to the core. But it affected it did affect all of us worldwide and how we go about like packaging things that we consume. And that was after 7 people, one of them being only 12 years old, trustingly reached for a very common household remedy to alleviate their ailments, which was Tylenol. And what they didn't know was within those bottles, there was a silent killer just waiting to strike without warning. I had seen this case in passing and I was always curious about it, but I had not taken any, deep dive into it to learn how intricate this was and how many paths had intersected between victims, suspects, and detectives. And it was an effing roller coaster when I listened to the podcast Unsealed: The Tylenol Murders by Christy Katowski and Stacey St. Clair. And they were actually reporters at the Chicago Tribune, which also intersects into the case. It's a wild case. So if you haven't heard that podcast, you know nothing about it, definitely go and check that out if you want to actually hear from a lot of the people who were involved in the investigation and victims' families and stuff like that. But if you want to also just hang out with me, then let's get into it. We're going to start with the Tylenol murders themselves and then just kind of branch out from there. You're probably going to want to take some notes, grab whatever you need to get settled in here for the next little bit because you are not going to want to leave your screen for a moment because you will miss something. So while you get yourself situated, I do have a quick message for you. Thank you to our sponsor today, Love and Pies, my all-time favorite game, my go-to. I promise you, if you are going to CrimeCon and you see that I'm on my phone, if I have a free minute and I'm on my phone, I 100% am playing Love and Pies. If you don't know what it is a mobile game free to download on your phone, tablet, Android, iOS. And it's just a very cozy, relaxing, fun game to play. But it's got a great story behind it that totally gets you, into a different world, which I definitely need. The game revolves around you, who is a single mom named Amelia, and you have taken over your mom's burnt down cafe. And then the aim is to redecorate and build it back to a business. But you're also trying to solve the mystery surrounding your mom's disappearance and why the cafe was on fire in the first place. You meet so many fun, cute side characters. There's always additional objectives to do, events going on, competitions, which I love because it keeps things really fun and exciting, and I'm extremely competitive. And you get through the story by serving customers, by matching ingredients to create either pies or whatever is on their request. There's tons of baked goods, drinks, all that good stuff. And then as you complete the orders and get tips, that's what progresses your upgrades within the cafe. And I love that aspect of it because you can make the design choices and customize it to make it your own. And the options are always so beautiful, so fun. And they kind of have a bunch of different, aesthetics. And I never know which one to choose from. And what I didn't learn on until later is you're not committed to one. So if you're torn between a couple, that's okay. Try them out. And then you can also go back and try it again and mix and match to really personalize it for yourself. And then it's during those renos that you also get clues and then you progress further into the storyline and meet new characters and stuff like that. It is just, I haven't really played anything like it. It's so fun. This game has definitely become such an important part of just like escaping researching and reality sometimes. So if you're going to download it, please download it with the link in my description. Thank you again so much, Love and Pies, for sponsoring this video and for being just the greatest escape for me to just go and chill and, I don't know, just feel comforted in my little game that has turned into such a big part of my daily routine. In 1982, a young couple named Adam and Teresa Janice were just peacefully living their lives in Arlington Heights. They were both originally from Poland, and Adam and his family had actually moved to Chicago from Poland when he was just a little boy. But when he gone back to Poland to visit family, that's when he met Teresa. They fell in love, and she moved to be with him in the United States. They got married. They had 2 kids. He got a good job with the post office, and they were just living a very content, cozy life. No idea that something millions of us do for relief would shatter their world on Wednesday, September 29th, 1982. It was Adam's day off from work, which ended up working out because he woke up not feeling the best. He had laid low for a large portion of the day until he had to go and pick up his daughter from preschool. And then on their way back home, he stopped at the grocery store. He picked up some lilies for his wife, and then he also bought some steak for dinner and a bottle of Tylenol. When he got home, he took 2 of the Tylenol pills, and his wife Teresa said that only minutes later he came out of the bathroom and he was holding his chest, telling her that he wasn't feeling well and he was going to go lay down. And so she was concerned and went in behind him and instantly knew that something was severely wrong. She had suspected that he was having a heart attack and ran to the neighbors for help. Adam was rushed to hospital, and unfortunately he could not be saved. At 3:15 p.m. he was pronounced dead, and he was only 27 years old. And him going in with the suspicion of it being related to his heart and a heart attack at his age, it's not unheard of to have a heart attack, but there were definitely questions just based on his health history. Like, he seemed to be in really good shape, which was also reflected in the medical reports. The paramedics had said that when they arrived to provide aid, he was alive, but there was like no responsiveness behind his eyes. It was like they were open, but he wasn't moving or anything. And then they could see that there was like rapid but shallow breathing attempts. Now, this is where things go from, very concerning, trying to figure out what's going on with Adam, to absolutely unimaginable for this family. So after Adam passes, the family goes to his and Teresa's house to be there for Teresa. And among those people is Adam's brother Stanley and his wife Terry Janice, who had just gotten home from their honeymoon. I mean, this is like one of the happiest times of their lives. And now they're coming home to hear this about Adam. And so they're back at the house, and they're both not feeling well either. And they separately come across Tylenol in the bathroom, and each took 2. Adam and Stanley's older brother Joe was also there, and Joe said out of nowhere, Stanley comes out of the bathroom and he collapses, and he's got white stuff coming out of his mouth. They immediately call an ambulance, and the responders that are getting the call are shocked because they're like, we were just there at this house like hours ago. So paramedics arrive, they start working on Stanley, and they remember Terry standing there holding onto her husband, crying, like pleading for them to help him. And then all of a sudden she collapses. So both of them are rushed to the same hospital that Adam had just been rushed to hours earlier. The same doctor that pronounced Adam dead meets the ambulance outside and immediately starts working on the 2 of them. While there are life-saving efforts being made on Stanley and Terry, the rest of the family and the first responders were put into quarantine in the hospital to try to figure out what was going on, like if there was something back at the house, if there was some virus that was wiping through. And so while they were there, a public health official had gone to the house and found this bottle of extra strength Tylenol in the bathroom. And then in the garbage, there was a receipt showing that it had been purchased earlier that day. And when she counted the pills, 6 of them were missing. So she brought those pills back to the hospital, gave them to the investigator with the medical examiner's office, and said, I think that it has something to do with the Tylenol. Later on that evening, the fire lieutenant who had left the hospital that had been on both calls radioed to his team saying that him and the other first responders that were in quarantine were going back to the station to decontaminate. And it's still at this point, they don't know what's going on, but the hospital felt like for the first responders, it wasn't like a virus or something, and they would be okay to go. And so it just so happened that when he made this announcement over the radio, one of his friends, who's also a lieutenant, had heard this radio call and phoned him to see what was going on. And so he tells his friend about this like mind F of a day and says, based on what the health official found, it seems like the only common denominator at the moment was that everybody had taken Tylenol from the same bottle within this house. So instantly, the other lieutenant thinks about a call that he just had with his mother-in-law that morning, who told him that her co-worker's 12-year-old daughter had just died that morning too. Her name was Mary Kellerman, and she was only 10 miles away in Elk Grove. She woke up to go to school but had a sore throat, so she took Tylenol, and then minutes later she also was gone. And hearing about that just made me sick. Like this little girl was in grade 7. And sadly, the deaths did not stop at those 4. 2 other people collapsed after taking Tylenol, and in a very unsettling twist, they both also were named Mary. That was 27-year-old Mary Reiner and 31-year-old Mary McFarlane. Mary Reiner had just given birth to her 4th baby, and like many moms do in those early days, like postpartum, she was taking Tylenol from the pain. She also collapsed and died after taking the Tylenol. And then a few hours later, Mary McFarlane, a single mom who had a headache at work, also took Tylenol to relieve it and also died. Her coworker said that it wasn't even 10 minutes after Mary had said that she wasn't feeling good, took the Tylenol, she also collapsed. Hearing all of those stories put together, like I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like living in those areas as the word spread. Unfortunately, at the hospital, Stanley passed away pretty quickly after arriving. Terry was put on life support. And after learning about this Tylenol connection, there was blood samples that were taken from Stanley and Adam and taken and rushed to the lab, overnight for testing. So while doctors are waiting for the results, naturally they're just kind of trying to rack their brain thinking about Tylenol and that there's something wrong with the Tylenol, but also knowing that none of the Janus family was showing signs of acetaminophen poisoning. So in their gut in those early moments, it was that if it had something to do with the Tylenol, then something had been done to compromise the Tylenol and that it was poisoned with something. And when the results came back early the next day, that suspicion was confirmed because the Janus brothers both had a lethal amount of cyanide in their blood. The bottle of Tylenol from their house was also tested, and in each pill, there was enough cyanide to kill at least 3 people. I cannot freaking imagine what that would have been like as somebody taking that, trusting it for relief, and dying that way. Sadly, after they got the results back, Terry's condition declined and she was taken off life support. So officially at this point, there were 6 people who had presumably died because of Tylenol poisoning. Well, I guess not Tylenol poisoning, because that would think like it was Tylenol, like the Tylenol being poisoned and poisoning them. I got so emotional listening to the podcast about Stanley and Terry, because when they had been pronounced dead, they hadn't even gotten their proofs back from their wedding photographer. That was like how soon everything had happened for them, and they were so young. He was only 25, she was only 20 years old. Like, it just like, I don't know what the fuck is wrong with people. Since there were 6 people dead, 3 of them being from the same family, but then another 3 being in different areas and didn't seem to have any connections to each other, the morbid realization really was that there was a killer on the loose who deliberately did this. They had intentionally gone to poison pain reliever. And as you can imagine, once they find this out, they're literally racing against time to get this information to the public as quickly as they possibly can. But we have to remember, like, we are in the very early 80s. We didn't have things like social media to just make a message go viral in minutes. So because of this, sadly, the number of deaths did not stay at 6. This wouldn't be something that would come to light with the initial investigators on those 6 murders, though, until a little bit later. I feel like the term groundwork really, it makes sense when you think back onto these older cases, because that's really what happened once there was lab confirmation that cyanide was in these Tylenol bottles. People were like going out onto the ground. Police were driving around with bullhorns, warning people all across the area not to take any Tylenol. Pharmacies were quickly ripping off all of the Tylenol across the country. And once Tylenol figured this out, they're concerned, obviously, about their reputation and trying to prove and gain trust from everybody that they have no idea what's happened. And they were also getting involved in the investigation by offering a $100,000 reward for any information on who tampered with their product. Quickly, the FBI also got involved and joined the local law enforcement departments that were already on the case, and they ended up all coming together and naming their group the Tylenol Task Force. The first thing they started was just going through the logistics, because there was a lot to sift through, specifically just finding out how poison got in there in the first place. So they had figured out that out of the 6 victims, there were 4 bottles of Tylenol that were poisoned, and those bottles came from 2 different factories in 2 different states. So they felt confident that something wasn't happening within the manufacturing process, because then you'd have to think like this would go like into a whole cross-state conspiracy. So after looking at the lot numbers and eliminating the transportation and the storage facilities, the theory came that the tampering had to have taken place at the stores. Now, I don't know why I remember some of the Tylenol being like this. I don't know if like Canada took a little bit longer to change the way that they packaged. I'm not sure, but I do remember Tylenol being like this. But in 1982, the bottles came in like the same kind of packaging that it is, like the box, but the box wasn't glued shut. So you just kind of like pop it open. And then once you opened up the bottle, you just popped open the cap and there was like a little cotton ball there. So that was like the only barrier between the like the outside world and the pills inside once you open up the bottle. So it would be really easy for somebody in store to, unfold this paper or this cardboard box and then just like pop open the top, take out the cotton, put in those pills, and then put it back on the shelf. So next, once they thought that they figured out like how it had happened, that it was within the store, they wanted to obviously find out who would have had a motive to do this. So they started looking at possible employees who were upset with the pharmacies, any customers who had issues with Tylenol or that specific pharmacy that these Tylenols were purchased at. And to help with any tips, they ended up setting up a tip line. And on the first day, they had over 150 calls and more than 6,000 tips to sift through, which I don't know why. I think it would have been like so much more difficult because of it being in the 80s. Like I like still answer the phone and one person take a call, but I was just like, oh, that would probably have been a very daunting task. So while they're working through all of that, another Tylenol victim is found. And on Wednesday, September 29th, which was the day of the Tylenol murders, 35-year-old United Airlines flight attendant Paula Prince had left a note in her best friend and coworker's mailbox at the Chicago International Airport. And the note had said that she had some really exciting news to tell her friend. And the two of them actually happened to live in the same apartment building. So when Paula's friend Jean had got back to their building that night, she calls Paula to catch up and find out what the news is, but Paula didn't answer. And 2 days went by, and Jean realizes she still hasn't heard from Paula and is becoming increasingly concerned, and that just further intensified when she missed her next flight and didn't pick up her paycheck from work. It was Jean who called Paula's sister Carol to let her know about her concerns and said, I'm going to go into the apartment. And Carol also is worried about what's going on and also doesn't want Jean to do it by herself. So she's like, just wait. I'll come with you because I don't want you to do it alone. And the two of them opened up Paula's apartment and immediately saw her down the hall on the floor, and her lower part of the body was still in the bathroom. And their first thought was that there was an intruder in there. Somebody had murdered her, and feared that whoever had done it was still in the unit. So they run out in hysterics, call 911, and wait for the police in the lobby. And they eventually find out that there was no physical murderer in Paula's apartment and that she was the seventh victim of somebody who had killed his victims by not even being present at the time of their deaths. After Paula's death, things within the investigation got really murky. I feel like, I don't mean to harp on the 80s or anything like that. I feel like we're only like a few minutes into this case and I'm already doing that. But I feel like we did see that a lot, like in the 80s and 90s, where there was like competitions within different, police departments. So Paula had died in the city of Chicago and not in the suburbs like the other victims, which meant that the Chicago Police Department now were also involved in this Tylenol task force. And with them joining and the FBI, there are 5 different police departments on this task force now. So people are feeling like there are too many cooks in the kitchen, racing to crack the case first. And on top of that, there was a lot of tension between the Chicago police and the FBI. I guess a little while before the Tylenol murders, the FBI had done a year-long investigation into the Chicago Police Department for corruption and found out that there were 10 Chicago police officers who were taking bribes in exchange for protecting heroin rings. There were also other crimes that were happening, and so ultimately 10 Chicago police officers were arrested. They became known as the Marquette 10. And so that whole thing really tarnished the reputation and also did not do anything for the relationship between the Chicago police and the FBI. And so when the Chicago Police Department came on to the case, they just immediately had a guard up and felt like the FBI particularly were like looking down on them. Eventually, the tensions between them kind of started spilling between everybody within the Tylenol task force, and everyone was basically disagreeing about everything. While that's going on, a week after finding out about Paula, a letter arrives at the Johnson & Johnson headquarters. It was sent through the mail and it was 1 page long with neatly handwritten capital letters, and it was an extortion letter. The letter was 1 page long. It was neatly written in capital letters, and it was an extortion letter that basically said it was easy to get potassium cyanide and sodium cyanide into the pills, and that the murders wouldn't stop until $1 million was sent to the writer of the letter. It was unsigned, but there was a bank account to deposit the funds in. So when they looked into this bank account, it ended up belonging to a business in Chicago called Lakeside Travel, which was a travel agency. Also on the letter was a postage meter ID, and that was on the envelope, sorry. And something that I learned from Christy and Stacy's podcast is that companies registered postage meters within the U.S. Postal Service. So they each got a 7-digit number that was assigned to specifically that company. So if you used the company meter, that number would be like imprinted on the envelope. So in this case, that envelope it led to Lakeside Travel as well. So the owner of that company was named Frederick Miller McKay, who, on top of having this travel agency, was also the heir to the Miller Beer Company. He was very easy to find and willing to talk, and he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the letter or the killings. And through talking with him, the task force didn't feel like he had a motive, and they ruled him out pretty quickly. But they had also found out that his company, Lakeside Travel, had gone out of business earlier that year, and that the bank account that was in that letter wasn't even active. It was closed. So they turned their attention to the staff that was working at Lakeside Travel at the time, who would have access to the postage meter, who would have known the bank account number, and who would have had a motive. So while looking at the former employees, they come across the Richardsons. Nancy Richardson was a bookkeeper at Lakeside Travel. She hadn't been there long, but had gained a lot of trust within the company. She was witness to it declining. And when the company tanked, Nancy's last paycheck bounced, which ended up adding like a whole other issue, because she had actually cashed it at a currency exchange place, which didn't catch that there wasn't money in the account right away. So they gave her the money. And then when they realized there was no money, they wanted the money back from Nancy, which she didn't feel like she was responsible for. So she wanted the company to have to pay for it, since she had worked the hours and they were the ones who wrote the check, which the company was not willing to do because there was no money in the company. So the the currency agency ended up suing Nancy, and this threw her husband into like rage mode. He was actually described as being angrier than the actual employees who had been screwed over, and he had rallied all of the former employees to go to the Illinois Labor Department, and he represented them as their group leader. This kind of made me giggle a little bit, because that would be my mom 100%. If she hears about something going on and somebody being like mistreated or being screwed over by, like a big wig or something, she takes it really personally. So it was Robert that was like, he laid it all out there, had said that he believed Fred had personal accounts that he had siphoned money into before the company went under, and felt like the wages that were owed to these employees, he should have to pay. Ultimately, they actually ended up losing, which pushed Robert into further rage. And then through learning all of this, it came out that in those final days of Nancy working at Lakeside, she had grabbed some blank envelopes that had the company's postage meter on it. I was like, okay, some people take pens and post-it notes, but she took the prepaid envelopes. And so investigators believed that's how the Johnson & Johnson extortion letter had the Lakeside ID number on it, because it was Robert Richardson. I'm going to use air quotes here because we'll get more into that later, but Robert Richardson had sent the letters wanting to get back at Nancy's boss, making it look like it was Fred who had sent it. So investigators went to find the Richardsons, and when they got to their last known address, they find out from the neighbors that they had moved. So again, remember, this is 1982. Things aren't really as easy to find people and get like a mass message out there. So the task force got their hands on some photos of who they thought were Nancy and Robert, and then sent out a poster to all of law enforcement across the nation and also news stations too. Someone who is watching the news reports about the story of the 7 deaths being linked to poison extra strength Tylenol capsules is a sergeant in Kansas City. And obviously, this case piques his interest. And all of a sudden, the segment cuts to the headshots of this man and woman, and it says Robert and Nancy Richardson. And he says, like, all of these years later, when he was recounting those moments, he remembered like rolling off of the couch, jumping up and yelling, "Oh my God, that is Jim Lewis." So he knew who was being shown on the television as Robert Richardson as James William Lewis. And he had actually obtained a arrest warrant for Jim Lewis is usually what you'll see him be referred to in a lot of reports. And he had gotten a arrest warrant for him that past winter. But when he went to go grab him, Jim and his wife, Leanne Lewis, not Nancy Richardson, had fled their home in Missouri. He immediately calls the FBI, shares his information. But another thing adds complexity to everything here, because while he's sharing information about Jim Lewis, another suspect had been named, and his name was Roger Arnold, and he was just arrested for murder. The same day that sergeant had called the FBI to share his information, further complicated things even more than they already were, because a different suspect had been named. His name was Roger Arnold, and he had just been arrested for murder. Now, it was the Chicago Police Department that had made the arrest, and because I tried to get away with saying that, arrest. Now, because of the tensions and everything being really high, specifically within the task force and the FBI and the Chicago PD, they were the ones who had responded to the death of Paula Prince, who was the flight attendant. Chicago PD had been the ones to respond to that. So they were kind of like looking at Paula's case as, you guys worry about your stuff. We're going to worry about Paula, and we're going to figure out who did this. And once we do, focusing just on Paula, then everything else is going to come together. So Chicago PD had gotten a tip from a bartender who said that 2 regulars told the owner of the bar that their friend, Roger, had been acting pretty strange lately. He was erratic and had admitted to people in passing that he had purchased cyanide about 6 months ago to do some sort of project at his home. Once Chicago PD got his name, he's brought in for questioning, and they learn that he had recently got a divorce a few months prior. Things were not going well in his life. He had lost his home to his ex-wife. He was really depressed over the whole situation. But they also learned that he worked at Jewel Foods, which was a grocery chain where some of the tainted Tylenol was. He had worked for Jewel Foods. Did I say at? Well, I guess at for, whatever. But he didn't work like in the store. He worked at the warehouse, unloading and loading the trucks. And this was also the same warehouse one of the victims, Mary Reiner's father, also worked. Mary was the one who had just given birth days prior, and allegedly Roger and her father occasionally ate lunch together, so they knew each other. With this information, it gives a possible connection to one of the victims through the father. And then on top of that, you also have the disturbing comments that he's made about poison and admitting to people that he's purchased cyanide. So it doesn't look good. He even went to his house with detectives to search his house, and they found more questionable things in his basement. There was like a makeshift lab with vials and beakers, and then he also had order forms to order more chemicals from. On top of that, they also found a one-way plane ticket. I am struggling today. Every day, let's be real. Ticket to Thailand, leaving on October 15th, which was just like a few days away from when he had been brought in to be questioned. So obviously this doesn't look good, but they have no way of figuring out what motive it would be, just, aside from the fact of him just being some lunatic who got a kick out of it. Going back to talking about that time, I guess there's still that time. It's not fair for me to say that time, but going back to talking about egos, I guess, and wanting to be the person to solve the case. The issue was those other detectives had already built some trust with Roger. They felt that they were on their way to possibly getting a confession from him. But when the other, higher up detectives came in, it kind of botched everything because Roger did not want to talk to them, and he immediately asked for an attorney, which just shut down everything. After he stopped cooperating and talking to the detectives, there wasn't really anything that they could pursue in terms of charging him with the Tylenol murders. The only thing that they had was charging him with failing to register a few guns that he had in his house that they found during their search. Once he gets this charge, he's released on bond, and he is livid. He's on this mission to find out who called the police and said his name, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. A couple weeks after the Tylenol murders, Roger was at the bar fuming over what had happened to him and that somebody said his name. And he learns that it was another bar owner named Marty Sinclair that had mentioned his name to police. Once he had that name, it just intensified his focus, his anger, his rage. He's continuing to go to bars every night and drink and get angry. And one evening in mid-June 1983, Roger left his house to go and drink and took a gun with him. And around midnight, somebody told him that Marty was at a restaurant just up the street. So Roger left the bar to go and confront Marty. He sees a group of friends walking outside and just yells out, "Marty, did you turn me in?" And he just pulls out his gun and shoots a man that he thinks is Marty. And his last words were, "I don't want to die." And he just slowly just like, I'm dying, and eventually died. After shooting this man, Roger walks away. He drives to the Chicago River, throws the gun in the water, goes to a hotel to call his lawyer, and then turns himself in the next day. And it's the next day that he finds out that the man he shot was not Marty Sinclair, who he thought had named him to police. He killed an innocent man named John Stainslaw. Roger was ultimately convicted of murder in January 1984 and sentenced to 30 years in prison for killing John. Despite the fact that he clearly had intense rage issues and was capable of murder, the FBI did not support the Chicago PD further pursuing him when it came to the Tylenol murders. So they never interviewed him. And after speaking with the police sergeant in Kansas City, they further zeroed in on Jim Lewis. The reason the Kansas City sergeant wanted Jim was because of his involvement in an identity theft ring, which was pretty complex, especially for, the time. It involved like setting up fake mailboxes and stuff, but the mail carriers had caught on. They informed the police, which the police set up a 24-hour surveillance to try to catch the thieves. And that's when Jim Lewis got on their radar. And this was a year before the Tylenol murders. They also learned that he had run a tax business, and there were a number of clients that he allegedly ripped off, scamming them out of almost $20,000. With that information, investigators had gotten an arrest warrant, but by the time authorities drove to arrest him and his wife had already left. One of the reasons why the Kansas City detectives were so invested in catching Jim was because the fraud case was almost kind of like a redo. There was another case that got him on their radar 2 years prior, and it had involved a missing man named Raymond West. Raymond was also somebody who liked to help out a lot in his neighborhood. His neighbors said that he was often just outside on his porch waving to the neighbors as they walked by. And everybody described him as just somebody who's really helpful and liked to go that extra mile to help other people. He even saved his newspapers and then took them to the florist to use for their business every Sunday. Something else people knew about Raymond was that he was very conscious of money. He was a lifelong bachelor and retired from his job as a truck driver in 1978, and he had retired with about $50,000 saved up. In July of that same year, Raymond's relatives and friends had gotten worried when they hadn't heard from him for a few days. So his good friend went to go and check on him and was perplexed when he saw that his car was there, but there was no sign of Raymond. And there was also a padlock on the door and then a board that was holding up the door from the inside at the back door. He calls police, and police find out that nobody had heard from Raymond since Sunday, July 23rd, and it was around dinner time. He had made a call to a friend of his, just mentioning that he had just gotten back from the grocery store. They had some small talk, and within that conversation, he told her that his tax man had been hanging out around the house quite a bit lately, and it was making him uncomfortable. He could never find out the reason, he wasn't asking him to come, and so he just thought that it was a little bit fishy that he was there. And he named his accountant as James Lewis. The Kansas City guys had quite a bit of background information on James. They knew that he had a pretty rough upbringing. He was actually born Theodore Wilson in Memphis, but he and his 7 siblings had their parents abandon them. I believe it was child services who had just basically found them abandoned and put them into foster care. And that's when Jim was adopted by a couple named Floyd and Charlotte Lewis. They renamed him James, and he was just described as kind of a loner when he growing up. He didn't have a lot of friends, and when he was 12 years old, his adopted father died. His mom eventually remarried, and now he gained another stepfather. And I guess there was definitely tension within the home. He exhibited a lot of disturbing behavior when it came to controlling his emotions. His parents alleged that he was suicidal at points. He had gone missing for a couple days, and they said that he had tried to drown himself. And then when he was brought home, he had demanded they get his stepfather's gun out of his cabinet so that he could, end his life. And when his stepfather wouldn't give him his gun, I guess Jim had assaulted him and broken his ribs. So a lot of issues there. Jim denied this and said that the whole thing was made up and that everybody was in on it so that he could avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War. As far as I know, he wasn't drafted. When he was 20, he enrolled in college classes, and it sounds like education-wise, it wasn't a big success. He had flunked, but this is where he had met his wife, Leanne Miller. And she had a background that was very different than his. She had very well-off parents. She was very close to them. They even gave Leanne and Jim a house as a gift, which they settled into, started a family. In 1969, they had a little girl named Toni. She was born with some health complications. She had a heart defect, and she also had Down syndrome. And when she was about 3 months old, she had a major heart surgery, which she survived. And people who knew Leanne and Jim said that they were definitely they were active parents when it came to her care, and even joined a lot of support groups for parents with children who had Down syndrome, which I can imagine would have been very important, especially in those times where people didn't, talk about or weren't as accepting if your child had Down syndrome. Like I know we hear just terrible stories of if a baby was born with Down syndrome, they were just basically put into like an institution and their parents would just like kind of leave them. So, hearing, kind of like thinking back and hearing about that time that there were support groups for parents back then, I'm sure was very comforting. Now, in the 70s, Jim had got some brief experience working in the tax business that ended up souring with his boss because he had threatened to beat up his boss. And then after that, him and Leanne had decided to open up their own home business together, which they called Lewis and Lewis Tax Service. Raymond lived just around the corner from them, and he would walk by their house all the time. So he had kind of gotten a little bit of a relationship with Jim and had him to do his taxes for a couple of years. Sadly, around this time, when Toni was 5 years old, she had another major heart surgery, and she did not make it through that surgery. She had died a couple weeks after her operation. And so it was 4 years after Toni's death that Jim started visiting Raymond more and more and more. And I think it started out maybe in Raymond's mind as just kind of like leaning on somebody. But eventually Ray had told friends he felt Jim was very pushy, and he didn't like his pushiness. And he felt like he was trying to get too close, but he wouldn't elaborate like what terms that meant, like what he was trying to get close to. According to records, Jim was contacted about Raymond's disappearance, and he had told investigators that Ray had just gone to the Ozarks with a girlfriend, and that's why he wasn't responding, but that he was expected to return pretty soon. I was going to say quite quick and pretty soon at the same time. Pretty soon. Let's go with that one. When Raymond's friends found out this is what Jim said, it didn't make sense to them because Ray didn't have a girlfriend, and they were pretty confident that Ray would let them know if he was going on a trip somewhere. So his friends weren't buying any of it, and they decided to file a missing persons report with the Kansas City police. And one of his friends, after filing this report, decided to go back to Raymond's house and just look around. Now, this time when he goes back, he sees this sign on the door that wasn't there before, and it said, "Mr. West has gone to the Ozarks for 3 to 4 days. If you need to contact somebody in the meantime, contact Jim." And it was on Lewis and Lewis stationery. After seeing this note, Raymond's friends called the police again and asked them to come and just look around. And this time they noticed some things that are odd. In the guest bedroom, the chair that Ray would always listen to music on wasn't there, and there was no bedding on his bed. It was just like the top sheet, like just a single sheet was there. And there was also a note on the coffee table that said, "Please don't disturb after 1 p.m. Sleeping late, signed Raymond." And that note was suspicious just in general, but the friends noticed that he never would sign his name or say Raymond. It was always Ray. Something else about Raymond was that he stopped by his bank once a week, every week. And so the people at the bank knew him very well. And he would always notify the bank teller if he was going to write a check for somebody that was going to be over $100. So they knew, okay, like up to 100, whatever. But if I'm going to write something a little bit larger, like I'm going to let you guys know about it. So when a check comes through his account for $5,000 that he's written to somebody, alarm bells go off and they immediately turn it down and mark it as a forgery. It turns out this check was made out to Lewis and Lewis, Jim's tax business. And when police asked Jim about it, he said that Raymond knew about it, and it was basically like his services that he was doing, which sounds ridiculous. Like, I just paid my accountant to do my taxes and it wasn't fun, but it wasn't $5,000. With all of this and the fact that no one can confirm this with Raymond because he's allegedly in the Ozarks, it's looking extremely suspicious. And Raymond's friends are not letting it go. So 3 weeks later, they call the Kansas City police again. They say he has not come back from this supposed trip to the Ozarks. And this time when they go to Raymond's house, they find something that they hadn't found when they were there earlier. They see that there are several areas within the house that have some blood. There's some spots on the floor, some on some sheets in the house. And then in one of the bedrooms, there's like this blood stain that is in the closet ceiling. And up in that closet, there's the attic. And when they pull down the door or the latch to climb upstairs, they found the body of Raymond West. Due to the heat in the area that year, it was not possible to confirm the cause of Raymond's death, but they did release that the body had been dismembered and then hoisted into the attic with this like makeshift police system. With Jim having so much involvement and people dropping his names, he's questioned. His fingerprints were taken. There was also a search in his vehicle where they found 34 canceled checks belonging to Raymond in the front seat of his car, and then also found a briefcase that had Raymond's tax returns in it. On top of that, they found a piece of like a rope that had matched the rope that was around Raymond's body. So the piece that they found was only about an inch in his vehicle, but it matched that same rope that was around Raymond in the attic. And then there were hair samples collected from Raymond's bathroom that later matched Jim Lewis. Jim repeatedly denied having any involvement in what happened to Raymond. He said he had an alibi and that one of his friends had picked him up as he was walking not far from Raymond's house at 7 p.m. on the last night that Raymond had spoken to a friend, and that the three of them, Jim, his friend who picked him up, and Jim's wife, had gone to a movie around 9 p.m. and then just walked around the mall together after that. Kansas City police ended up arresting Jim and charging him with murder. And almost a year later, when it was time to go to court, there were a lot of issues with the case, one of them being that the coroner could not establish an exact cause of death. And then another huge flaw was that as the prosecutor was preparing for trial, they realized that in the very first interview that was ever done with Jim Lewis, detectives didn't read him his Miranda rights. So everything that was gained from that point in the investigation was inadmissible, which means that they couldn't mention the ropes in his car, the checks, the matching hair, and the whole case had to be dropped. So this makes a lot of sense why Kansas City police were so adamant on getting charges when it came to the fraud cases, because it was almost like, okay, like we need him back in our clutches again. And once they learned about the Tylenol task force, they gave them the remaining evidence that they had. Unfortunately, a lot of evidence was destroyed, but they did have things like his handwriting samples. They had a fingerprint that was also lifted from that like makeshift pulley system in Raymond's attic, and records show that there was a match. Lab reports had taken that fingerprint from the pulley system and that it matched Jim Lewis's right thumbprint. Jim had been questioned about that, and he said that he thinks that it was just, he's some scapegoat, and finds it very strange that when Raymond had died, there was allegedly no fingerprints, but then once the Tylenol task force came on, now all of a sudden a fingerprint appeared. And so he says that is like basically invented evidence. It ended up being irrelevant though, because the pulley was missing from the evidence. And then because of the Miranda violation, there wasn't enough. They couldn't reopen the case. Like all of their really like hard-hitting evidence had come after that initial interview. Even though that was a huge upset to Kansas City Department, the Tylenol task force was not deterred, because they are looking at this as him being a very strong suspect in the extortion letter. Like all signs are pointing to him when it comes to the letter. And then that kind of leads into possibly being involved in the murders as well. Once they zeroed in on him, he wasn't hard to find. He had actually sent out other extortion letters from New York. So the first one that he had sent was to President Ronald Reagan. And in the letter, he basically threatened the president, and he threatened that he was going to plant cyanide in stores across the country if the president didn't avoid like increasing taxes. So makes a threat about planting cyanide in stores. And then basically he's like, yeah, so that we don't have to pay taxes. This letter he signed Fred M., which everybody kind of assumed was him again trying to put blame on Fred McKay, who was his wife's ex-boss. And then he had sent other letters later also pointing to Fred. He sent some to the Chicago Tribune with like this big packet of how they, it was impossible that they could have committed the murders, and then added all of this like information about how Fred was just a crappy person and had screwed over a lot of people, and they were just trying to do their civic duty by pointing the finger at him to get the investigators on the right track. Finally, another letter was sent, and this one wasn't about Fred, but it was kind of, investigators took it almost like a taunt. It was sent to the Department of Justice, and it had a copy of a news article talking about how the Tylenol investigation was really slow moving and that they still hadn't made a lot of headway. And then on the back, it was a photocopied piece of this article, and then on the back of it was his driver's license. So it was kind of like, you guys are really slow, like here's my ID, like let me help push things further. So something in common within, I keep saying so something in common with all of these letters is that everything was coming from New York, but he's referencing a lot of the Chicago stuff, and investigators figured he was getting the information in like Chicago newspaper articles from the library. So they distribute his face to the public libraries across New York. And eventually librarians see somebody who looks like Jim taking notes in this library cubicle. She calls the FBI, they come, and sure enough, it was Jim, and he was arrested in this cubicle, and he's writing down addresses to major American newspapers, which just further supports that this was him and no one impersonating him, sending out these taunting letters to political officials and American newspapers. Once they had him in custody, the judge set his bond to $5 million, which that sounds astronomical for an extortion letter, but given everything and the fact that this was a high profile case and there's potentially 7 deaths just with the Tylenol, then you've got Raymond, then you've got everything that he's done, it makes a lot of sense. But I think back on that, it's like $5 million in the 80s. The issue here, though, was proving his connection to the Tylenol murders was a struggle because they also had to contend with Roger Arnold as a viable suspect that a defense would use to shift the focus off of Jim. Remember, Roger had admitted to buying cyanide to multiple people, and then the only connection that Jim had to cyanide whatsoever was during the search of his house back in that first investigation. Investigators found a book that basically said like it was called the Handbook of Poisoning, but no actual poison. There was a couple pages that did talk about cyanide that his fingerprints were on, but you would suspect that your fingerprints would be on the whole thing because, I mean, you own the book and you're reading it. Another issue they came across was proving that he was in Chicago because, as far as everybody knew, the Lewises had left Chicago in early September, which was a month before the murders. They were able to find out that they had lied about where they were going. The Lewises had told their friends they were going to move to Texas, and then records showed that they had taken the Amtrak to New York and did this under aliases instead. So suspicious. But in those weeks between leaving Chicago and the murders, they have them staying in a hotel in New York City. And they were unable to tie Jim coming back to Chicago from New York. They looked into him possibly using another identity and were not able to find any records of him having some alias and getting on a plane or a train to go back to Chicago. While this investigation is going, trying to tie him to the murders, he's still behind bars for that extortion. And then in October 83, his trial starts. And to kind of bypass anything that the prosecutors were maybe going to try to lead into putting suspicion on him for the Tylenol murders, Jim's lawyer just opens up with the fact that Jim did write the letter. He says that Jim knows that it was very reckless and very foolish to do it, but the reason he did it was to expose Fred, who he said was committing a crime, and that he wasn't committing a crime himself. He just wanted to expose somebody else so that they could be held accountable. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty, and while he was waiting for sentencing, he reached out to law enforcement and tells them that he wants to help them with solving the Tylenol murders. At this point, they have nothing to lose, so they take him up on his offer. And he says that he thinks he's going to be like a really good asset because he believes he's very smart and he understands how the federal government works. So in the first meeting, he explains all of the reasons why he isn't the Tylenol killer. This is kind of one of those situations where his insight makes you think that it's possibly a confession when he's asked if the Tylenol poisoner had picked extra strength Tylenol so that a child wouldn't take any. He breaks out hysterically laughing and says, "No, that's the joke. Don't you get it? There's something extra in the capsule." Like, no, Jim, we don't get it. That's why we asked. Completely missed that. Then he started making these drawings for investigators of ways that a person could get cyanide into the capsules and how it could be transported and put into the bottles on the shelves. And he said that he drew these with like his thought process, but also got some insight with some of the other inmates on how it could have been done. So it was like a group project collaboration type thing. He detailed it down to you need to fill the male part of the capsule only, because if you fill the female one, you wouldn't be able to get the male capsule on it. So like you just fill the male one and then put the female one on top of it. Another detail that he also drew out was getting this cyanide into the pills, and he thought that this person could have done it with the drill board method is what he called it. So it was basically a piece of plywood where there were a bunch of holes that were drilled into it, and then the capsule was like one end of the capsule was underneath the plywood, and then there's like this large pile of cyanide on the side of the board, and then you would just scrape it, and then the cyanide would fill the capsules, and then you would cover them up. Based on these drawings, it looked like Jim was pretty knowledgeable, and there was probably a reason why he knew so much. In their opinion, allegedly, is probably because he was the one who did it, and that's the method he used. And they felt like they were getting close to him providing more evidence that he was the person to do it. But he said that if he was going to give them more information, they needed to promise him that moving forward, nothing that he said would be used against him in court, which the FBI could not agree to, and that ended their communication. When it came time for sentencing for the extortion letter, prosecutors did bring up some of the interactions after the fact, trying to prove a stronger case that he reached out to us. This is what we know, and we kind of believe that there's a reason why he knows all of this. And the judge took it into the judge listened to the evidence, but said that he wasn't going to take it into consideration because it just wasn't enough to prove that he was a murderer, and wasn't going to consider it when it came to sentencing for the extortion. So at the end of it all, Jim was sentenced to 10 years for attempted extortion, and he was also sentenced to serve that back-to-back with his fraud convictions, which was a total of 20 years. There was a point in 89 where he was up for parole, and once several detectives got wind of this, they had actually wrote the parole board saying that they did not believe this was a right decision. He was a threat to public safety, and that it was imperative that he serve his entire 20 years. And what happened when they got involved was the commission had decided to get together and hear all of the evidence as to why he shouldn't be considered. There was a hearing that was held. It was a 2-person panel, and evidence supporting why they truly felt like he was responsible for those 7 deaths was discussed in this hearing. And this was the first time that any government official had acknowledged that it didn't look good and that he most likely was the murderer, and they decided to take away his opportunity for early parole, and he had to stay in prison. Now, this is just a civil opinion, which is not the same as criminal. So even though there's a government agency that is saying, yeah, Jim Lewis is sketchy AF and he's probably the murderer, it doesn't do anything in terms of adding extended sentencing or even just that acknowledgement for the families and the victims that he was the one who did it. In 1995, Jim Lewis was released from prison, and in 1998, Roger Arnold, the other name that was floating around, was also released. Roger had served about half of his 30-year sentence, and those who knew him said after his release, he tried to start life over again. He got a job. His employer described him as a reliable employee, and he lived a very quiet life. But 10 years after his release, his friends said that he believed that he was being haunted by his past. He was having nightmares of John Stainslaw, the innocent man that he had murdered. And when his friends couldn't get a hold of him for 2 days, they went to go and check on him, and they found him dead on his bathroom floor. It looked like he had slipped and hit his head. So he was no longer alive. And after Jim was released, he moved to Cambridge, where his family had relocated, and he also tried to rebuild his life, stay busy. He ended up launching like a web service company, but I guess didn't stay out of trouble for long. In 2004, he got into a disagreement with his neighbor, who was also a business associate or partner of his, and things took a terrifying turn. She accused him of rape, kidnapping, indecent assault, drugging for sexual intercourse, and drugging to confine. He did spend 3 years in jail awaiting trial, but when trial approached, his accuser decided she didn't want to testify against him, and prosecutors had to drop the charges, so he was released. Through the years, Jim would acknowledge when people asked him about the scrutiny and the looming suspicion of him being the Tylenol murderer, that he knew that he was a suspect. That was no secret, but he always maintained he could not be the person to do it because he was in New York and not in Chicago, and he would always go to that, and that the investigators had no way of putting him in Chicago. He even collaborated with someone he thought was a journalist in 2006 to write a book about the case and everything surrounding him. It was actually an undercover FBI agent that was trying to gain his trust. It was a really extensive, I guess, operation. They ended up calling it Task Force 2 because a lot of the people who were on the initial Tylenol task force had either passed or retired. So this was almost like a revamp. And for over a year, they worked on this book together, even assisted Jim in writing a fictional book called Poison. If the plan and goal was for him to confess, though, it never happened. At the end, there was a raid that was done at Jim's condo and some storage lockers that he had. They had found a handwritten note that said, yes, I am the killer, but I have 10 good reasons. Within the reasons, it was pretty much to teach people a lesson, to wipe out scum, which is sickening to even say when you look at the victims and their innocence. Unfortunately, this raid didn't lead to enough to prove without a reasonable doubt that he was the one that was responsible. It was just, even more circumstantial and really sketchy evidence. But once this raid happens, he realizes that this whole book collaboration was a ploy and fake. He ends up going to the internet to share his side. He started a website basically saying that the undercover agents had coached him into writing a lot of these things. They also inspired the book. This wasn't his idea, and had paid him thousands of dollars and wined and dined him to try to gain his trust and make a case out of something that wasn't there. Once again, they never got their smoking gun, but they wanted to try to present a case to the prosecutors. They showed the letters of Jim Lewis saying that he was the killer, all of the aliases that he had used. They had even talked to jailhouse snitches who said through the years that he was incarcerated, he had made some incriminating statements about the Tylenol murders. They also included the drawings of how the poison had gotten into the capsules, his poison handbook, as well as information that they had learned that after being released from jail, he was starting a business where he was going to export pill press machines, which is very concerning given the scrutiny and the attention on you involving pills. The closest thing that they presented to prosecutors in terms of a motive was something that involved his daughter, Toni. After Toni had passed, remember just before her death, she had had another open heart surgery. And once she died, the medical examiner did the autopsy, and in their report, they had said that the sutures that the doctors had used to, repair her and close the wound had torn. Those sutures were sold under a brand name Proline, and Proline was trademarked 5 years earlier by Johnson & Johnson. So they believed with Jim's rage, revenge history, he could have intentionally targeted the company to make them look awful and make them, suffer and go down and implode because of them failing his daughter. The last piece of evidence that they brought forward was a secret video or undercover video that was taken. It was taken at a hotel in downtown Chicago with Jim Lewis and Agent Roy Lane, who is actually on the first task force and was involved in this undercover operation. And during this conversation, Jim is kind of questioned about timeline inconsistencies that he had given. He had initially told the FBI that it took him 3 days to write the extortion letter. The extortion letter arrived at Johnson & Johnson on October 5th, but on the envelope, they could see that the postmark date was Friday, October 1st. In the video, Jim insists that the letter was sent on the 1st, and he asks the undercover agent what day the killings had happened. So the agent sketches out a calendar of that year and counts back 3 days from the 1st, and it lands on Wednesday, the 29th, which is when all of the victims were poisoned and killed. And he insists that there's no way that letter could have been written the same day that everybody was dying, because it didn't hit the news until the next day, the Thursday, the 30th of September. So if you're the one writing the letter and you're admitting that you write the letter and it hasn't hit the news, well, how do you have that information if you weren't the one who knew what was happening? And the only thing that Jim was able to say was that he must be remembering it wrong in his mind, and that for 25 years he has told himself that it took him 3 days, but it must have been a lot sooner, because it was impossible for him to have been the one to do it with or have knowledge of it before it hit the news. And the reason why they are stuck on the time frame is because there was a lot of information in the letter. He would have had to look up information about cyanide, learn about all the capsules, research Johnson & Johnson. Again, he didn't have technology on his side. So this wasn't like a quick Google search to get all of this. It would have been possible to do, but the investigators did not think that it would have been easy or something that would just instantly have come to his mind to be like, oh, this happened out there. I'm going to take this opportunity to frame Fred. Once again, all of this information makes a case stronger, but there is no direct physical evidence leading him to the killings. So again, there are no charges filed. And now we are left with the fact that there is even more uncertainty if that will ever happen, because not only has it been over 40 years where you are losing witnesses, evidence, you're also losing the investigators. But last year in 2023, Jim Lewis died at the age of 76, meaning that the families of those who lost their loved ones still are at the exact same spot they were when their loved ones died. They have no explanation, no justice or reasoning who did this and why. Stacy and Christy, who had done the Tylenol podcast prior to Jim passing, he was still alive. They actually had hunted him down and tried to talk to him a little bit. They still have contacts with investigators on this case, and officially they're being told that the case is still ongoing, but that everything kind of adding to it basically ends there. They don't see anybody else besides Jim Lewis being the killer. So unless there are further advancements in DNA to provide without a shadow of a doubt that it was him or somebody else, they can't charge him when he's not alive in hopes of like having a circumstantial case go through, which is so frustrating. I cannot imagine what that would feel like being a family member after all of these years. This case is like, it's horrific when you actually sit down and look at it and see all of the links, and I don't know, even when you factor in Raymond, there's just so much that's in this case, and it's huge. Like, this changed the way that we buy not just like medication, but even like food forever. When I was listening to the podcast, Stacy and Christy were talking about going through case files and learning that investigators would be called often to look into food tampering and stuff like that, where somebody would purchase a jar of peanut butter, and there would be somebody who had swiped their finger in it and tasted it. And nowadays, so much of what we get has that foil on it and is sealed. And it's because of this case. Like, this case changed so much. Like I said, prior to this case, like, the medication just had that little cotton ball barrier. Now there's 3 barriers. You've got the cardboard box that has the glue on it. So, like, if that's ripped off, it's questionable. But on top of that, you've got the plastic seal around the cap. So you have to rip that open. And then once you get the cap open, then you have that aluminum seal protector. And for that, I'm so thankful. I always try to look at a positive when we talk about a case, especially when it's unsolved. And that I am thankful for, because as much as I want to wish that we could trust people, we know from this channel, you absolutely freaking cannot at all. Like, there's no doubt that this would have continued to happen so much more. Like, people are just whack jobs out there sometimes. My hope is that our advancements in technology just keep progressing sooner than later. I hope specifically for this case, because I do believe that a lot of these unsolved cases, there are hopes, when I think a lot of people have felt for so long that it's like hopeless of them being solved. I definitely have to commend the task force for just not giving up all of these years, not giving up on the families and the victims. I can imagine how frustrating like every roadblock would have been throughout these years. Like, this has been over 40 years, but I'm sure just like with for the family, especially having spoken to a lot of family myself, I know that that's something that means a lot to them, is like when they know that their investigators care as much as they do and check in and just reassure them that they're not giving up. Even if they don't have anything new, it's just like the fact that they know their loved one hasn't been forgotten. So I can't imagine what that feels like after all of these years, to be like, it's not looking extremely hopeful after 40 years, but we're not giving up, and we haven't given up, and we've gotten, blocked and roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, but we're still here. So I don't know. I wish there was more we could do, but for now, I'm thankful that we have made progress in protecting society as a whole from lunatics like whoever it was that did this to those victims. Okay, that is it for me today. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you all, every one of you, so much. I cannot wait for CrimeCon. It's coming so soon, and I just want to squish everybody. So if you're going and you're not like a hugger, just tell me ahead of time. Just be like, hey, love you, but like I don't want to hug, because I will attack. All right, I will see you in the next video. I will miss you. Oh, and if you haven't got your tickets, don't forget to use my code Sherrilyn, okay? And let them know that you love me. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon.